A widow, barely surviving on the frozen frontier, gave her last warm meal to a shivering stranger. She had nothing left to lose. He had nothing left to give. But weeks later, when dozens of riders thundered into her yard, what happened next would restore everything she thought was gone forever. This is the story of Martha Brennan, a cold winter night in Copper Ridge, and how one act of kindness returned as a blessing she never saw coming. Before we continue, don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Snow swept across the Arizona high country like a curse. The wind screamed through the narrow streets of Copper Ridge, rattling loose shutters and bending the skeletal branches of cottonwood trees. Most folks had barricaded themselves indoors, their fires burning low, their voices hushed against the howl of winter's rage. The town itself seemed to crouch beneath the storm, small and fragile against the vast emptiness of the frontier. But one light still flickered in the darkness. Martha Brennan's boarding house stood at the edge of town, a two-story structure of weathered pine that leaned slightly to the left, as if tired from years of standing alone. The paint had peeled away long ago, leaving bare wood exposed to the elements. The roof sagged in places where snow had gathered too heavy, and the front porch groaned under the weight of winter. A single oil lamp burned in the window, its glow weak but steady like the heartbeat of something refusing to die. Inside, the warmth was thin. The fire in the hearth had been fed sparingly, each log a calculated sacrifice. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the walls carried the smell of old wood and fading hope. The dining room, once filled with the laughter of travelers and the clatter of full plates, now stood mostly empty. A few chairs remained pushed beneath tables that rarely saw use. Dust had begun to settle in the corners, quiet as grief. Martha moved through the room with the slow precision of someone who had learned to stretch every moment, every task, into something that filled the silence. She wiped down a table that didn't need wiping. She straightened a chair that was already straight. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of work, moved without thought, guided by routine rather than purpose. She was a woman in her late 40s, her face lined by more than time. Loss had carved itself into her features, not cruelly, but deeply. Her dark hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back in a simple bun. Her dress, patched and faded, hung loose on a frame that had grown thinner with each passing season. She wore her late husband's old wool shawl, wrapped tight around her shoulders, the fabric worn soft from years of use. Thomas had been gone 3 winters now. Fever had taken him quickly, leaving her alone with a boarding house too big for one woman to manage, and debts too heavy for one woman to carry. She had tried. God knows she had tried. But the world had moved on without waiting for her to catch up. The new trading post on the north end of town had drawn away most of her lodgers. Travelers preferred the newer building with its sturdy walls and cheaper rates. The few who still came to Martha's place did so out of pity or old loyalty, and even that was fading. The banker, Mr. Garrett, had stopped by twice in the past month, his voice polite but firm, reminding her of payments overdue and patience wearing thin. Martha paused by the window, her breath fogging the cold glass. Outside, the snow fell in heavy sheets, erasing the world beyond. She thought of the wood pile out back, nearly gone. She thought of the pantry, its shelves growing bare. She thought of the lamp oil burning lower each night. And she thought, as she often did in the quiet hours, whether it was worth keeping the light on at all. Then, through the storm, came the sound of hoofbeats. Slow, unsteady, growing closer. Martha lifted her head, her breath catching. No one traveled in weather like this, no one with sense, anyway. The hoofbeats stopped just outside. Martha Brennan had not always lived on the edge of ruin. There had been a time, not so long ago, when the boarding house thrived. When Thomas was alive, the rooms upstairs had been full nearly every night. Cattlemen driving herds to market, prospectors chasing silver dreams in the mountains, families making their way west, all had passed through the doors of Brennan's boarding house, drawn by Martha's cooking and Thomas's easy laughter. Back then, the dining room had buzzed with conversation. The smell of fresh bread and roasted meat filled the air. From dawn until well past supper, Martha would move between tables, refilling coffee cups, her apron dusted with flour, her face flushed from the heat of the stove. Thomas would sit at the corner table, swapping stories with the guests, his voice booming, his hands gesturing wildly as he spun tales of the old days. But those days were gone. Thomas's death had been the first crack in the foundation. The fever came sudden and brutal, burning through him in less than a week. Martha had nursed him as best she could, but the doctor had been 3 towns away, and by the time he arrived, there was nothing left to do but watch. Thomas died on a Sunday morning, the light streaming through the window, his hand still warm in hers. The funeral had been well attended. The whole town came, it seemed, to pay their respects to a man who had never turned anyone away. But respect, Martha learned quickly, did not pay debts, and Thomas, generous to a fault, had left behind more of those than she'd known. At first, she tried to keep things going. She cooked, she cleaned, she smiled at the guests even when her chest felt hollow. But the work that had once been shared between two now fell entirely on her shoulders. The building, already showing its age, began to deteriorate faster than she could repair it. A shutter broke loose in a windstorm. The roof leaked after heavy rains. The front steps splintered and cracked. Each repair cost money she didn't have. Then the trading post opened. It was a newer establishment, built with fresh timber and backed by investors from back east. They offered lodging at half Martha's rates, and their dining hall served meals prepared by a cook trained in San Francisco. Within months, the steady trickle of guests that had sustained Martha slowed to almost nothing. She lowered her prices, but it didn't help. She couldn't compete with new wood and Eastern money. The debts piled up like snow against a fence. First, the lumber yard owed for materials Thomas had bought to repair the barn before he died. Then the general store, where Martha had been buying her supplies on credit, stretching each dollar until it snapped. And finally, the bank. Mr. Garrett had been patient at first, his voice soft with sympathy. But sympathy, like respect, had limits. "Mrs. Brennan," he'd said on his last visit, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands, "I can't hold the note much longer. The bank has obligations, you understand." She understood. She understood that her home, her livelihood, everything Thomas had built, was slipping through her fingers like sand. Martha had tried to find help. She'd asked at the church, but the congregation was small and struggling itself. She'd written to Thomas's brother in Kansas, but the letter came back unopened, marked "Return to Sender." There was a cousin in Texas, but Martha had too much pride to beg from family she hadn't seen in 15 years. So she carried on alone. She rose before dawn each morning, not because there was work to do, but because lying in bed meant facing the silence. She kept the boarding house clean, even though most rooms sat empty. She cooked small meals for herself, rationing what little food remained in the pantry. And each night she lit the lamp in the window, a signal to any traveler who might brave the cold that there was still warmth here, still a place to rest, even if she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep that promise. The winter had been particularly harsh. Snow came early and stayed late, closing the mountain passes and keeping travelers away. Weeks would go by without a single guest. Martha would sit alone in the dining room, the fire burning low, listening to the wind test every crack in the walls. She had begun to wonder if she was simply delaying the inevitable. The days bled into one another, each one a mirror of the last. Martha woke in the gray hours before dawn, the cold biting through the thin quilts piled on her bed. The room she slept in had once been a guest room, smaller than the one she'd shared with Thomas. She couldn't bear to sleep there anymore. Too many memories lingered in that space, too many ghosts. She dressed quickly, her fingers stiff as she fastened the buttons of her worn dress. The floor was ice beneath her bare feet until she pulled on Thomas's old socks, thick wool that bunched around her ankles. She wrapped his shawl around her shoulders, the fabric still carrying the faintest scent of him, tobacco and leather, and made her way downstairs. The boarding house greeted her with silence. She moved through the dining room, her footsteps the only sound, echoing off the empty walls. The tables sat waiting, their surfaces clean but untouched. She'd set them the night before, out of habit more than hope. Plates arranged just so, forks and knives aligned, napkins folded with care. It was what Thomas would have done. It was what a boarding house was supposed to look like, ready, welcoming, alive. But no one came. Martha lit the stove, coaxing the embers back to life with kindling she'd split herself. The wood supply was running dangerously low. She'd have to make a decision soon, burn what little remained to stay warm, or save it and freeze. The fire caught slowly, reluctant, as if it too had grown tired of the effort. She put on a pot of coffee, more for herself than anyone else. The beans were stretched thin now, mixed with chicory to make them last. The brew came out weak and bitter, but it was hot, and that was enough. She poured herself a cup and stood by the window, watching the street outside. Copper Ridge was waking, though barely. A few figures moved through the cold, hunched against the wind, their breath rising in clouds. The blacksmith's forge glowed faintly in the distance. The general store's door opened and closed as early risers shuffled in for supplies. Life continued, as it always did, indifferent to those struggling to keep pace. Martha turned away from the window and busied herself with tasks that didn't need doing. She swept the floor, though no dirt had gathered since the day before. She wiped down the bar in the corner, its wood darkened by years of use. She checked the pantry, counting what remained. A sack of flour, half full, a tin of lard, a few strips of dried beef, some beans, enough for a week, maybe 2 if she was careful. She thought about the money hidden in the tin box beneath the floorboard in her room. $32. It was all she had left in the world. Not enough to pay Mr. Garrett, not enough to restock the pantry, not even enough to make it through the winter if things didn't change. By mid-morning, Sarah arrived. She was a girl of 15, daughter of a widow who lived on the edge of town. She came 3 times a week to help with the heavier chores, sweeping, hauling water, splitting kindling. Martha paid her what she could, though it was never much. The girl never complained. She worked quietly, her thin frame bent over the broom, her hands red and chapped from the cold. "Any guests coming, Mrs. Brennan?" Sarah asked, her voice soft, almost apologetic, as if she knew the answer, but felt obliged to ask anyway. Martha shook her head. "Not today." Sarah nodded and went back to sweeping. The sound of the bristles scraping against wood filled the silence, rhythmic and hollow. By noon, Martha prepared herself a small meal, a slice of bread, toasted over the stove, a thin soup made from the last of the beef bones, boiled until they gave up whatever flavor remained. She ate alone at the corner table, the one where Thomas used to sit. She stared at the empty chair across from her and wondered how much longer she could go on like this. The afternoon stretched long and cold. No travelers came. No one knocked on the door. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, testing the seams of the old building. Martha sat by the fire, mending a torn apron, her needle moving slowly, mechanically. She thought about closing the boarding house, just locking the door and walking away. But where would she go? This place was all she had. Without it, she was nothing. A widow with no family, no money, no future. So she stayed. As evening approached, Martha lit the lamp in the window. She always did, even on nights when no one was coming. It was a promise, however small, a signal that someone still cared, that warmth still existed in a cold world. She stood there for a long moment, watching the flame flicker behind the glass, and then she heard it. Hoofbeats in the snow. The door shuddered under the force of the wind as it swung open. Cold air rushed in, swirling snow across the floorboards, and with it came the man. He staggered more than walked, his boots dragging heavy across the threshold. His hat was pulled low, brim weighed down with ice, and his coat, a battered duster that had once been brown, now hung stiff and dark with the frozen slush. His shoulders were hunched forward, arms wrapped tight around himself as though trying to hold his own body together. Martha rose from her chair, instinct overriding caution. The man made it 3 steps inside before his knees buckled. He caught himself against the nearest table, his gloved hand slapping the wood with a dull thud. His breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the cold air, each exhale a shuddering cloud of steam. "Mister?" Martha's voice cut through the silence. She moved toward him cautiously, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mister, are you hurt?" The man lifted his head slowly, and for the first time Martha saw his face. Young, maybe 30, with a few days' worth of dark stubble along his jaw. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his lips had taken on a faint blue tint. His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, were unfocused, struggling to find her. His voice cracked, dry and weak. "I just need to get warm." He fumbled at his coat pocket, his fingers clumsy and stiff. After a moment, he pulled out a small leather pouch and set it on the table. It landed with barely a sound, flat and light. He opened it with trembling hands, tipping it over. A few coins spilled out, nickels, a couple of pennies, maybe 30 cents in total. "Coffee," he said, the word barely more than a whisper. "Please, just coffee." Martha stared at the coins. She knew that desperation. She'd felt it herself, counting pennies in the dim light, trying to make nothing into something. The man swayed where he stood, his hand still braced against the table, and she realized he might not make it much longer without help. "Sit," she said firmly, pulling out a chair, "before you fall." He obeyed without protest, collapsing into the seat as though his legs had given their last. His head hung forward, and he kept his hands tucked under his arms, trying to coax warmth back into his fingers. Martha moved quickly. She grabbed a blanket from the back room, one of the thick wool ones she kept for guests, and draped it over his shoulders. He flinched at the touch, then pulled it tighter around himself, his body shaking beneath the fabric. She went to the stove and ladled out a bowl of stew. It was simple: potatoes, carrots, and a bit of salted pork, stretched thin to last. She'd made it for herself, intending it to be her meals for the next 2 days. But looking at the man, hollow-eyed and shivering, she couldn't keep it. She set the bowl in front of him, steam rising in soft curls. Then she poured a cup of coffee, strong and black, and placed it beside the stew. Finally, she cut a thick slice of bread, the last of the loaf she'd baked that morning, and set it on a small plate. The man stared at the food as though it were a mirage, his mouth opened, but no words came. He looked up at her, confusion and disbelief flickering in his eyes. "I can't." He glanced at the coins on the table. "That's not enough to—" "It's enough," Martha said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned away, busying herself at the counter, not wanting to see the shame in his face. For a long moment the man didn't move. Then, slowly, he picked up the spoon. His hand shook as he brought it to his lips. The first taste seemed to break something in him. He ate slowly at first, deliberate, as though afraid the food might vanish. Then faster, the spoon scraping the bowl, his shoulders curling forward over the meal like a man protecting something precious. Martha kept her back turned, wiping down the counter that didn't need wiping, giving him the dignity of eating without being watched. The only sounds in the room were the clink of the spoon, the crackle of the fire, and the wind howling outside. When the bowl was empty, the man tore into the bread, soaking up every last drop of broth. He drank the coffee in long, grateful gulps, the warmth finally bringing color back to his face. Martha heard the scrape of the chair as he stood. She turned to find him on his feet, the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. He looked steadier now, though exhaustion still lined his features. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough but sincere, I don't have words for what you just did." Martha waved a hand dismissively. "It's just a meal." "No," he said quietly, "it's more than that." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and a stub of pencil. He scribbled something quickly, his handwriting shaky, then folded the paper and placed it on the table beside the empty bowl. "I won't forget this," he said. Before Martha could respond, he turned and walked toward the door. The wind hit him as he stepped outside, but he moved with more strength now, pulling himself up onto his horse. The animal stamped and snorted, shaking snow from its mane. Martha stood in the doorway, watching as the man rode off into the storm, his figure disappearing into the white. She closed the door and returned to the table. The coins still sat there, untouched. Beside them, the folded paper. She picked it up and opened it. Inside, in rough, uneven letters, were 2 words, "Thank you." Martha folded the paper again and slipped it into her apron pocket. She gathered the coins and placed them in the till, though they wouldn't make a difference. Outside, the storm raged on, and inside, Martha stood alone once more. The days after the cowboy's visit were the hardest Martha had known. The storm that had driven him to her door lingered for nearly a week, dumping snow across Copper Ridge until the drifts reached the windowsills. The mountain passes closed completely, cutting the town off from the outside world. No supply wagons came through, no travelers, no one. Martha rationed what little food remained, a single meal each day, barely enough to keep the hunger at bay. She boiled the last of the beans until they were soft, mixed them with the remnants of flour to make a thin porridge. She chewed slowly, trying to make each bite last, trying to convince her body it was enough. It wasn't. The cold pressed in from all sides. She burned the wood sparingly, allowing the fire to die down to embers before adding another log. At night, she piled every blanket she owned onto her bed and still woke shivering, her breath visible in the darkness. The walls groaned under the weight of ice and wind, and she wondered how much longer the old structure could hold. Sarah stopped coming. The snow was too deep, the cold too dangerous for a young girl to make the walk. Martha didn't blame her. She was glad, even. At least the girl was safe at home with her mother. But the silence that followed was suffocating. Martha moved through the boarding house like a ghost, her footsteps the only sound. She spoke to no one, saw no one. The isolation wrapped around her like a shroud, heavy and inescapable. She found herself talking aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was only her own. "Need to check the roof," she'd mutter, staring up at a water stain spreading across the ceiling. "Can't let it get worse." But she didn't check the roof. She didn't have the strength, the tools, or the will. One morning, she opened the pantry and stood staring at the empty shelves. The flour was gone. The beans were gone. All that remained was a small tin of lard and half a jar of preserves Thomas had put up years ago. She took the jar down, held it in her hands, and felt the weight of her failure settle over her. She'd fed a stranger, given him the last of her stew, her bread, her coffee, and now she had nothing. For a moment, anger flared in her chest. What had she been thinking? She was barely surviving herself. She had no business giving away food she couldn't afford to replace. That meal could have lasted her another 2 days, maybe 3, but the anger faded as quickly as it came, replaced by something worse, shame. Not for feeding the cowboy, but for regretting it. Martha sank into a chair, the jar still clutched in her hands, and let the tears come. They fell silently, streaking down her cheeks, dripping onto her apron. She cried for Thomas, for the life they'd built and lost. She cried for the boarding house, dying by inches around her. and she cried for herself, for the loneliness, the exhaustion, the crushing weight of trying to hold on when there was nothing left to hold. When the tears finally stopped, she sat in the silence, empty and hollow. Mr. Garrett came the following week, once the storm had passed and the roads were barely passable. He knocked on the door with his usual politeness, but his expression was set, his jaw tight. Martha knew before he spoke what he'd come to say. "Mrs. Brennan," he began, removing his hat as he stepped inside, "I've tried to give you time. Lord knows I have. But the bank—" "I know," Martha interrupted quietly. She didn't have the energy to hear the rest. "I know." He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "You have until the end of the month. After that, I'll have no choice but to foreclose." "The end of the month. 2 weeks." Martha nodded, her face expressionless. "I understand." Mr. Garrett lingered a moment longer, as if hoping she might say something, offer some plan, some solution. But Martha had nothing left to offer. He placed his hat back on his head and left without another word. Martha stood in the doorway, watching him ride away. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the snow. The town looked peaceful, almost beautiful in the fading light. But Martha felt none of it. She closed the door and moved through the boarding house, her steps slow and heavy. She paused at the window, where the lamp always burned. For a moment, she considered not lighting it. What was the point? No one was coming. No one ever came. But her hand moved on its own, striking the match, touching it to the wick. The flame caught, flickering weakly before steadying. Martha stared at it for a long time. She thought of the cowboy, the way he'd looked at the food she'd given him, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The note he'd left behind. "Thank you." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the folded paper, now worn soft from being carried. She opened it, reading the 2 words again in the lamplight. "Did it matter?" she whispered to the empty room. The flame flickered but didn't answer. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The night grew colder, and Martha Brennan, alone in her dying boarding house, wondered if kindness had been her greatest mistake, or her last act of defiance against a world that had taken everything. Martha woke before dawn, as she always did, though this morning felt different somehow, heavier. The weight of inevitability pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks she'd memorized over the years. 2 weeks. That's all she had left. She forced herself out of bed, dressed in the cold, and made her way downstairs. The routine was automatic now, muscle memory guiding her through motions that no longer held meaning. But when she reached the bottom step, she stopped. Something was wrong. No, not wrong, different. The air felt warmer, not by much, but enough to notice. She frowned, moving toward the dining room, her hand trailing along the wall. The wood beneath her palm was smooth, too smooth. She stopped, looking down at her fingers. No splinters, no rough edges. Her heart began to beat faster. She stepped into the dining room and froze. The tables gleamed in the early morning light filtering through the windows. Not the dull, worn surfaces she'd wiped down 1,000 times, but polished wood that reflected the room like dark mirrors. The chairs, some of which had been held together with wire and hope, stood sturdy and whole, their spindles tight, their seats solid. Martha's breath caught in her throat. She moved forward slowly, her boots echoing on floorboards that no longer creaked. The floor, she looked down. The warped, uneven planks that had buckled and split over the years were gone, replaced by smooth, level boards that fit together seamlessly. "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. Her eyes lifted to the ceiling. The water stains had vanished. The sagging boards were straight and firm. Fresh paint covered every surface, clean and white, erasing years of neglect in a single, impossible stroke. Martha's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the nearest table, half expecting it to dissolve under her fingers like a dream. But it was solid, real. The wood was cool and smooth, smelling faintly of oil and beeswax. She turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. The windows, which had been clouded with grime and age, were clear as glass, letting in streams of golden morning light. The curtains, faded and moth-eaten, had been replaced with thick fabric that hung in neat folds. Even the old oil lamp in the corner had been polished until it shone like new. Her mind struggled to make sense of it. This couldn't be real. She must still be asleep. This was a dream, a cruel trick her exhausted mind was playing on her. But the floor beneath her feet was too solid, the air too warm, the light too bright. Martha stumbled toward the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pushed open the door and stopped dead. The pantry shelves, bare and empty when she'd gone to bed, were now full. Sacks of flour lined the bottom shelf, plump and unmarked. Tins of coffee, sugar, salt, cornmeal. Jars of preserves in neat rows, their contents glowing like jewels in the light. Smoked ham hanging from hooks. Sacks of beans and rice stacked against the wall. She moved forward as if in a trance, her hands reaching out to touch each item, confirming its existence. The flour was heavy. The coffee smelled rich and dark. The ham was firm under her fingers. "This can't be," she whispered. But it was. The stove, which had been rusted and temperamental, gleamed black and sturdy. New pots and pans hung from hooks above it, their surfaces unmarred. The pump at the sink, which had wheezed and sputtered for months, worked smoothly when she tested it, clear water flowing without effort. Martha backed away, her hand pressed to her mouth. Her eyes were wide, tears gathering at the corners. She turned and rushed through the rest of the boarding house, throwing open doors. The guest rooms upstairs, which had been closed off for months, were transformed. Fresh linens on the beds, new quilts folded at the foot of each mattress. The floors swept clean, the windows clear. Furniture that had been broken or missing was replaced, solid and waiting. The roof. Martha climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, her breath coming in short gasps. She pushed open the hatch and looked up. The roof was whole. New shingles overlapped in perfect rows. No gaps, no leaks. Solid and strong. She descended the stairs slowly, her legs weak beneath her. When she reached the main floor again, she stood in the center of the dining room, turning in a slow circle, trying to comprehend what had happened. Who could have done this? How? And why? Her thoughts went immediately to the cowboy, the man she'd fed. But that was impossible. He'd had nothing. 30 cents and a note of thanks. How could he? Martha moved to the window, her hands shaking as she pulled aside the curtain. The street outside was still and quiet in the early morning light. Snow lay undisturbed across the ground. And then she heard it, faint at first. A low rumble in the distance, growing louder, closer, thunder, number, not thunder, hoofbeats. Martha's pulse quickened. She pressed closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. The sound grew, multiplying, not one horse, but many, dozens. The vibration ran through the floorboards, up through her legs, into her chest, and then they appeared. Riders streaming down the main street toward her boarding house. Cowboys on horseback, their hats low, their dusters billowing behind them. More than she could count. They moved together, a unified force, their horses kicking up snow as they came. Martha's hand flew to her chest. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. The riders turned into her yard, circling the boarding house, their horses snorting and stamping, and at the front of them all, sitting tall in his saddle, was the cowboy. The man she'd fed, but he looked different now, stronger. His face no longer gray with cold, but weathered and sure. His coat was clean, his hat straight, and his eyes, those same eyes that had looked at her with desperation and gratitude, now looked at her with something else. Purpose. The cowboy dismounted with a smooth, practiced motion, his boots hitting the ground with quiet authority. He stood for a moment, looking up at the boarding house, then turned his gaze to Martha, who remained frozen at the window, her hand still pressed against the glass. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest, and walked toward the door. Martha's legs finally obeyed her. She moved across the room, her heart hammering, and pulled open the door before he could knock. The cold morning air rushed in, but she barely felt it. Up close, she could see him clearly now. The hollow exhaustion that had marked his face weeks ago was gone, replaced by calm strength. His eyes, a deep brown, held hers with steady respect. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, his voice clear and strong. Not the broken rasp of a desperate man, but the firm tone of someone who knew his place in the world. Martha opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her eyes darted past him to the dozens of riders who had dismounted and now stood in her yard, quiet and watchful, men and women both, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their hands resting easy on their saddles. "I ... Martha's voice cracked. She tried again. "I don't understand. What is this? How did you—" The cowboy's expression softened. "Ma'am, weeks ago I came to your door with nothing. I was cold, hungry, and about as low as a man can get. I'd been riding for days, lost my way in the storm, spent every cent I had just trying to survive." He paused, his jaw tightening with the memory. "I had 30 cents left to my name. Barely enough for a cup of coffee, and you—" His voice caught, and he had to look away for a moment before continuing. "You gave me a meal. A real meal. You wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and didn't ask questions, didn't judge, didn't make me feel smaller than I already felt." He met her eyes again. "You gave me more than food, Mrs. Brennan. You gave me my dignity back." Martha shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It was just stew. Just bread and coffee. It was nothing." "No, ma'am," the cowboy said firmly. "It was everything." He turned slightly, gesturing to the riders behind him. "My name is Cole Hastings. I own the Double H Ranch up in the high country, about 40 miles north of here. That storm that brought me to your door, it scattered my herd, separated me from my men. I'd been riding for 3 days straight trying to find them, trying to get back home. By the time I stumbled into Copper Ridge, I thought I might not make it." He took a step closer, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. "But you saved me. And when I finally made it back to my ranch, when I told my people what happened, what you did for me—" He paused, a slight smile touching his lips. "Well, ma'am, we take care of our own. And anyone who takes care of one of us becomes one of us." Martha's hands flew to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. Cole replaced his hat and turned toward the riders. "These are my people, ranch hands, cooks, builders, family. When I told them about you, about this place, about what you were facing," he looked back at her, "they wouldn't let it stand. We've been working for 2 weeks, every night after the storm cleared. We brought supplies, tools, everything needed to restore this place. One of the riders, a woman with silver-streaked hair tied back in a braid, stepped forward carrying a large wooden crate. Others followed, pulling bags and boxes from their saddlebags. They moved with purpose, carrying their loads toward the boarding house. "You fed me when I had nothing," Cole said quietly. "Now we're here to make sure you never go hungry again." The riders began filing past Martha, tipping their hats, nodding respectfully as they entered the boarding house. They set down crates filled with food, supplies, firewood, oil for the lamps, fabric for curtains, tools for repairs. The pile grew higher and higher, spilling across the tables and floor. A young cowboy, barely 20, paused as he set down a sack of coffee beans. "Ma'am," he said shyly, "Mr. Hastings told us what you did. We're honored to help." Another rider, an older man with a gray beard, added, Any friend of Cole's is family to us. They kept coming, one after another, filling the boarding house with life and noise and warmth. Laughter echoed off the walls. Boots stomped across the floor. Voices called out to one another, joking, planning, moving with the easy camaraderie of people who'd worked together for years. Martha stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed, tears streaming freely down her face. She turned to Cole, who watched his people work with quiet pride. "I can't," she stammered. "This is too much. I can't accept." "Yes, you can," Cole interrupted gently, "because it's already done, and because you deserve it." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with wonder. She'd come early for her shift, and now stood frozen, taking in the impossible scene. Martha caught her eye and saw the girl's face break into a smile so bright it could have lit the whole territory. One of the ranch women approached Martha, pressing a worn leather pouch into her hands. "From all of us," she said warmly, "to help with whatever else you might need." Martha opened the pouch. Inside were bills, more money than she'd seen in years. Enough to pay Mr. Garrett. Enough to keep the boarding house running for months. Her knees buckled, but Cole caught her arm, steadying her. "Mrs. Brennan," he said softly, "you kept your light burning when you had every reason to let it go out. You showed kindness when the world gave you nothing but hardship. That kind of heart." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "That kind of heart deserves to be protected." Martha looked around at the faces surrounding her. Strangers who'd become something more. People who'd ridden 40 miles through winter cold to restore what she thought was lost forever. And for the first time in 3 years, since the day Thomas died, Martha Brennan didn't feel alone. The transformation was complete by midday. What had taken years to crumble had been rebuilt in hours. The boarding house stood proud once more, its walls straight, its windows gleaming, its heart beating with life that Martha had thought was gone forever. The scent of fresh coffee and cooking food filled the air, mingling with the laughter and voices of the ranch hands, who had made themselves at home. They sat in the booths and at the tables, swapping stories and sharing meals they'd brought from the Double H Ranch. One of the women, a cook named Rosa, had taken over the kitchen with Martha's permission, preparing a feast that seemed to stretch endlessly across every available surface. Roasted meat, fresh bread, potatoes swimming in butter, apple pie that filled the room with the smell of cinnamon and home. Martha moved among them in a daze, still trying to comprehend what had happened. Every time she turned a corner, she discovered something new: a repaired window frame, a fresh coat of paint on a door, a stack of firewood piled neatly by the hearth, enough to last the entire winter. Sarah worked alongside the ranch hands, her face flushed with excitement and joy. She carried plates, refilled coffee cups, and laughed more freely than Martha had ever seen. The girl looked up and caught Martha's eye, and the gratitude that passed between them needed no words. Cole found Martha standing by the window, the same window, where she'd kept the lamp burning through all the dark nights. He approached quietly, holding a fresh cup of coffee, and offered it to her. "Thank you," Martha said softly, accepting it. She took a sip, savoring the rich, strong flavor. Real coffee, not stretched with chicory or ration to make it last. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the activity around them. "I paid Mr. Garrett this morning," Cole said finally. "The debt is cleared. The boarding house is yours, free and clear." Martha's eyes widened. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Cole said firmly but kindly. "You saved my life, Mrs. Brennan. The least I could do was save your home." Fresh tears welled in Martha's eyes. She'd cried more today than she had in years, but these were different tears, not born of grief or despair, but of overwhelming gratitude and disbelief that such goodness still existed in the world. "I don't know how to repay you," she whispered. Cole shook his head. "You already did. The night you opened your door." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Mrs. Brennan, what you did for me, Feeding a stranger when you barely had enough for yourself, that's rare. Most people, they'd have turned me away, told me to move along. But you didn't. You saw someone in need and you helped, no questions asked. That kind of kindness. He paused, searching for the right words. That kind of kindness changes things. It changes people. Martha looked around the room, at the faces of these good people who had given so freely of their time and resources. I thought kindness didn't matter anymore, she admitted quietly. I thought the world had moved past it. No, ma'am, Cole said with certainty. The world needs it now more than ever, and people like you who keep showing it, even when it costs you everything. You're the ones who remind the rest of us what we're supposed to be. As the afternoon wore on, the ranch hands began to prepare for their journey back to the Double H. They packed their tools, checked their saddles, and said their goodbyes to Martha with promises to return. Some left small gifts, a carved wooden figurine, a jar of Rose's preserves, a hand-stitched quilt. Before Cole mounted his horse, he turned to Martha one last time. We'll be back, he said. Every month we'll send riders down with supplies. And any time you need anything at all, you send word. The Double H takes care of its family. Family, Martha repeated, the word feeling foreign and wonderful on her tongue. Family, Cole confirmed with a warm smile. He tipped his hat, swung up into his saddle, and with a signal to his crew, led them out of the yard. The thunder of hoofbeats filled the air once more, but this time it didn't carry the weight of mystery or fear. It carried the promise of connection, of community, of a bond that would not be broken. Martha stood in the doorway of her boarding house, Sarah beside her, and watched them ride away until they disappeared into the distance. The sun was beginning to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. Behind them, the boarding house stood strong and whole. And that night, when Martha lit the lamp in the window, it wasn't out of stubborn habit or desperate hope. It was a beacon, a signal that warmth and kindness still lived here, that anyone who came to this door, hungry, cold, or desperate, would find refuge, because Martha Brennan had learned something that day, something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. One act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change everything. It ripples outward in ways we cannot see, touching lives we may never know, returning to us multiplied in ways we cannot imagine. And sometimes, when we give from our emptiness, the world gives back abundance. The boarding house thrived from that day forward. Word spread through Copper Ridge and beyond about the widow who had shown kindness to a stranger and received a miracle in return. Travelers began stopping again, drawn by the stories and the warmth they knew they'd find. The rooms filled with guests. The dining room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Martha never turned anyone away, and she never forgot the cowboy who had stumbled through her door on a cold winter night, or the family of riders who had restored everything she thought was lost. Because in the end, that's what kindness does. It builds families where there were none. It creates hope where there was only despair. And it reminds us all that we are never truly alone. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness still matters in this world. And if you'd like to hear more true stories of compassion and the unexpected ways it changes lives, make sure you're subscribed, because sometimes the smallest acts of grace become the greatest stories ever told.